Oliver, for those who do believe like you, or those who would like to believe like me, we all have to face the problem of evil. And a lot of theodicies, people say why it might happen. Other people say, are more take a more easier view, in a sense, looking for a defense, how it might be, not necessarily how it is. The idea of skeptical theism says, we just don't know. And I sort of like that. I'd like to get your feeling on it. But then if we don't know about the problem of evil, what else don't we know? So how virulent does skepticism become if you allow it to do work for the problem of evil?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the problem of evil is one of the most fundamental religious problems, particularly for those in theistic traditions like the Judeo-Christian tradition. I mean, we want to know why is there evil, why does God allow it, and so on. There's been a lot of work done on this over the last generation from philosophers of religion who are Christian philosophers and Jewish philosophers. And theodicy is trying to find some justification for how God does these things, some story that you tell that justifies God's allowing of evil is one approach. Defense is another, where you tell, this is true for all we know. We don't know exactly whether it is true, but here's a story that's consistent. That's a slightly easier way to go. But you're right, the skeptical theist is saying none of those approaches are any good. We don't have a plausible story. That doesn't mean there isn't a plausible story. It means that we don't have one. And I'm much more attracted to that kind of view, and partly I'm attracted to that view because I think it's a view that you find reflected in some of the biblical texts, or at least consistent with the biblical texts. Think, for example, of the story of Job. Now, of course, we know what's going on behind the scenes in the Job story. We know that why Job is undergoing the trials that he is and so on, and when God turns up at the end, we see that as well. But Job is always ignorant of what's going on. And there's a sense in which all the traditional justifications his friends try to give him for why he's suffering all fail. And when God turns up, God doesn't offer another justification either. He just simply declares that he's God and Job must serve him. So I think that very much sort of lends itself towards a kind of skeptical theist way of thinking. And for me, it makes sense because we finite, limited human beings are just not in a position of epistemic access, as it were, in other words, access in terms of knowledge, to know the full picture, why God does what he does, and so on. And the Job story gives a really good example of that. Here's a person who's suffering, who's undergoing all sorts of trials and tribulations. He never knows why. We know why, because the story tells us why. It's bookended in that way. But it's a lesson to us. I think it may even be...
And God doesn't have to justify it to Job.
He doesn't. No, he doesn't. And that's the interesting thing. He never feels the need to do so. And so perhaps that should put us on our guard when we're trying to construct our elaborate stories to justify the ways of God to human beings, that maybe that might not be the right way to go.
My concern is, or maybe the benefit, is that once you allow skeptical theism to do the work for the problem of evil, which you like and I like, and we haven't discussed this before, we both like that, does it then kind of generate a power that now is applicable in other areas, maybe in areas you don't want it to go into.
Yeah.
And so now it's going to start invading other areas with its skepticism. Is
like areas like what?
Just any of the traditional Christian beliefs, for example.
Well, I think...
And undermine them.
Yeah, that might be a worry, but I think there's principal reasons for, as it were, confining the skepticism to this particular area.
But maybe, but if you allow it to work in that area, because that's your problem.
Yeah.
In other words, you have your schemes that work very nicely, but you have your problem of evil, which you got to get rid of. So you allow skepticism to attack your problem of evil. What I'm saying is maybe you can't contain it. That once you allow it to work here, it's going to seep out, and it's going to undermine some of your other doctrines.
That may be the case. I mean, it may be the case, but I think there are other doctrines where we similarly should be careful. We might even adopt a certain kind of skepticism, but it's not clear to me that just because we have a skepticism with respect to the problem of evil, or solutions to the problem of evil, that we should automatically think that translates to other areas of knowledge as well. I think you'd have to make a case for saying, well, what might be skepticism here should be applied elsewhere.
Do you see any other areas besides the problem of evil where skepticism may apply or may help you solve problems?
Well, I think there's a way in which we might think of skepticism in a kind of very careful way when it comes to certain Christian doctrines and how they're formulated. Now, I'm not saying I'm skeptical of the doctrine. Anyone who's skeptical theist is saying he's skeptical of the existence of God. What I'm wanting to say is particular formulations of the doctrine may be in some way insufficient. So, for example, with the Trinity, it may be that different accounts of the Trinity are insufficient, and ultimately we just have to admit that we don't have a very good account of the Trinity. We can confess the doctrine, but we don't have a very good metaphysical story that we can tell consistent with that doctrine.
And to go to skeptical theism, rather than sticking with, well, maybe we're just going to find it if we think harder, or have philosophers like you work harder in the future, maybe there's something deeply unknowable about that.
Yes.
for our mental capacity, and
Right.
skepticism is of that nature. It's not just that we are. It's not just that we lack the knowledge or sophistication to do it. Maybe we'll get it. It's that it's in principle unknowable.
That may well be the case for human beings. It may be in principle unknowable, at least in this and in our current evolved state. Maybe we just don't have the soggy grey matter there in order to do that kind of work.